This story is very meaningful. Everyone should hear it. Listen to Brian tell the story. My name is Christina, and I never imagined that my life would spiral into a nightmare of betrayal, deception, and fear. At 29, I thought I had everything figured out. Married to James, my husband of 3 years, living a comfortable life, and surrounded by a family that seemed supportive. But today, as I watched my sister-in-law Nina take a sip of the coffee that was meant for me, I realized how wrong I had been. It wasn't supposed to be like this. At first, things seemed perfect. James was charming, attentive, and Nina had been welcoming, offering help with our wedding and inviting me to family gatherings. But looking back, the signs were there. The little accidents, the strange food mishaps, the times I'd ended up in urgent care after meals with them. It all seemed too coincidental. Today, I was sitting at Nina's dining table in her elegant home in Nashville, pretending everything was fine. But inside, my heart was racing. James had made the coffee, and there was something off about it. It smelled metallic, almost like metal shavings, and my stomach churned at the thought of drinking it. But I had to keep up the appearance, especially with Nina watching me so closely. "Don't you want to try the coffee I made especially for you, honey?" James asked, his smile unnervingly bright, but his eyes didn't match. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind that made my skin crawl. I forced a smile. "How thoughtful of you." Nina, sitting across from me, stirred her own cup absently. "James has become quite the barista lately. He's been practicing different brewing methods just for you," she said, emphasizing "for you" with that smirk that sent a chill down my spine. Something was wrong. The way she said it, the way James was acting, it all felt like a setup. My mind raced as I tried to push down the panic. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Just last month, I ended up in urgent care after drinking tea at Nina's house. The doctors couldn't explain my symptoms, and Nina had insisted she made the tea exactly the same way she made it for herself. It was all too familiar, too calculated. I lifted the cup, pretending to take a sip. My eyes flicked to James, then to Nina. Their silent exchange, their quick glance, confirmed everything I feared. This was no accident. I couldn't prove it yet, but I knew. Something was off, and I had to find out the truth. "Oh, would you look at that?" I said suddenly, standing up. "I need to make a quick call for work. Nina, would you mind if I use your study?" I needed a moment to think, to figure out what to do next. Nina waved me off with a tight smile. "Just don't break anything in there." I nodded, hurrying to the study. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind was racing. I had to find a way to confirm what I suspected. I glanced back at the table, watching as Nina brought the cup to her lips. Part of me wanted to stop her, to warn her, but I needed to know the truth. I had to know if they were behind all of this. I stood in the doorway, my phone out, recording everything. Nina's hand trembled as she took another sip, and I felt my stomach clench with anxiety. James seemed oblivious, his face buried in his phone. But Nina, her face turning pale, suddenly set the cup down. "James, something's wrong," she said, her voice weak. James looked up, his face contorting from confusion to horror as he realized what had happened. "Nah, what's happening?" He jumped up, knocking his chair over, his panic becoming apparent. Nina tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her, and she grabbed the table for support. "James, what did you put in that coffee?" My heart was racing, but I didn't move. I had to let this play out. They had tried to poison me so many times before, and now it seemed their plan had backfired. Nina was collapsing, and James was scrambling to make sense of it. I stepped forward, my voice steady as I spoke into the phone. 911, please. My sister-in-law is having a severe reaction to something in her coffee. She's conscious, but she's experiencing tremors. The dispatcher's voice came through clearly, and I continued, watching as Nina's face twisted in pain. The sirens were already approaching outside, but I couldn't look away. This was it. This was my proof. Nina's eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, there was no calculation, no coldness in her gaze. Just raw fear. "You switched! You knew!" she gasped. I didn't flinch. My hands were steady, even as my stomach turned. I switched the cups. "I knew," I replied calmly. "You and James, you've been poisoning me for months, haven't you?" Nina's face paled further, and she slumped back into her chair. "We didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered, the fight draining from her. "James said it would be just enough to make you sick enough to miss the board meeting next week. We didn't think it would be this bad." Everything clicked into place. The tea, the breakfast, the unexplained symptoms. They had been trying to sabotage me all along. I turned to James, my voice cold. "You said it yourself. This wasn't about making me miss a meeting, was it? You needed me out of the way permanently. Because of the Henderson account. Because you knew I was outperforming you. But you didn't count on me fighting back." The paramedics burst through the door, and I stepped aside to let them work. Nina was loaded onto a stretcher, her body still shaking violently. I stopped recording, quickly sending the video to my private email, then to my lawyer. I had the evidence. Everything I needed. James stood frozen, watching as his carefully constructed plan crumbled around him. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead. I could see it now, the panic, the desperation in his eyes. "I'll ride with her to the hospital," I told the paramedics, my voice firm. "After all, I need to make sure my sister-in-law gets the proper treatment, and I'm sure the doctors will be very interested in knowing exactly what was in that coffee." I watched James's terrified gaze as the paramedics wheeled Nina away. The truth was coming out, and there was no turning back now. The emergency room at Nashville General Hospital was a blur of activity as doctors and nurses rushed to stabilize Nina. I sat in the waiting room, clutching my phone, replaying the recording of Nina's confession. Each word she had spoken, every tremor in her voice was clear now. This wasn't just paranoia or bad luck. It was an intentional campaign to destroy me. As I sat there, waiting, my mind kept replaying the events leading up to this moment. The subtle signs I had ignored, the strange occurrences that had piled up over the months. I should have seen it sooner, but I had always trusted James, trusted Nina. Now, all that trust had shattered. About 20 minutes after we arrived, the nurse finally called my name. "Mrs. Bennett," she said, her tone professional but with a hint of concern. "The doctor would like to speak with you about your sister-in-law's condition." I stood up, my legs feeling shaky, but I was determined. I was going to get answers tonight. As I followed the nurse through the sterile halls of the hospital, I noticed James was nowhere to be found. He had mumbled something about parking the car earlier, but it was unlike him to not be by Nina's side, especially in a situation like this. "How is she?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper as we reached Nina's room. "She's stable for now," the nurse said, leading me into the room, "but the doctor wants to go over some unusual findings with you." Dr. Phillips, a tall woman with graying hair and sharp eyes, was waiting near the bed. Nina was hooked up to several machines, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. I could see the fear that hadn't been there before. She looked small now, vulnerable. And I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction. She had gotten what she deserved. "Mrs. Bennett, could you tell me exactly what happened before your sister-in-law became ill?" Dr. Phillips asked, her voice calm, methodical. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. Should I tell her everything? Should I show her the recordings, the text messages, all the evidence I had gathered? No. I needed to be careful. Before she became ill, I began slowly. Nina and James had invited me to brunch. I was suspicious about the coffee I was given. It smelled odd, metallic almost. When Nina drank it instead, that's when she started to get sick. "Doctor," Phillips nodded as she listened intently, her eyes scanning Nina's chart. "We found concerning levels of toxins in her system," she said, her voice grave. "The substance we found isn't something that accidentally ends up in coffee. This is deliberate contamination." My blood ran cold as I looked at Nina. She was still too dazed to respond, but her eyes locked onto mine. For the first time, I saw the guilt, the realization that everything she and James had done had been exposed. Dr. Phillips motioned for me to follow her, and we stepped out into the hallway. "We need to run further tests," she said, "but based on the initial results, it looks like this wasn't just an accident. We're dealing with premeditated poisoning." I nodded, my hands trembling. "I've suspected it for months. I've been sick after every meal with them, hospitalized 3 times in the last 6 months. But it never seemed like enough evidence to prove what was happening." Dr. Phillips looked at me carefully. "You've been keeping track of this?" "Yes," I replied, pulling out my phone. "I've documented everything. Every time I felt sick after one of our meals. Every time something strange happened. I started carrying a backup phone to record their conversations, too." Dr. Phillips raised an eyebrow. "You were that suspicious?" I nodded. Something felt off. And now, with everything that's happened, I have the proof. We went back into Nina's room, where she was still recovering. Her face had regained some color, but the fear was still there. I stood in the doorway, watching her as she struggled to sit up. Her voice was still shaky as she spoke. "You switched the cups, didn't you?" Nina's voice was low, almost a whisper. "You knew what we were doing." "I knew," I said, my voice firm. "And now it's all coming out. Everything you and James have done. I have the recordings, the texts, everything." Nina's eyes widened with panic, and she opened her mouth to speak, but Dr. Phillips cut her off. "We need to address the substances in your system. They're not common. They're usually used in pharmaceutical testing. It's not something people would typically have access to," Dr. Phillips said, her tone now sharp. "Clinical, you stole them, didn't you?" I asked, my voice unwavering. I could feel my anger building, but I didn't let it show. "From the pharmaceutical company. The same company that helped James and Nina plan all of this." Nina's face contorted with a mixture of fear and rage. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she whispered. "We just needed to slow you down, make you sick enough to miss the Henderson presentation. You were taking all the big clients. You were always getting the attention. And James couldn't stand it. So, you tried to kill me to get rid of the competition," I said, the words coming out in a cold, steady voice. "You thought you could take me out and take everything I've worked for." I could hear James now, his voice distant but growing louder. I glanced toward the hallway, and he appeared at the door, his face pale, his expression frantic. "Christina," James said, his voice shaking. "Please, let me explain." I didn't move. My mind was made up. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, not some weird series of coincidences. James and Nina had been planning this for months, maybe longer. And now, their plan had crumbled in front of me. "You've been trying to poison me for months," I said, my voice steady as I looked at him. And now it's all out in the open. James stood there, frozen, his eyes wide with panic. He wasn't the man I had married 3 years ago, the man I had loved, the man I had trusted. No, this man was someone else, someone consumed by greed, someone who had let his jealousy and ambition twist him into a monster. "Christina, please," he said, his voice pleading. "You don't understand. We were just trying to help you. You were working too hard, taking on too much. We didn't mean for it to go this far." His words hit me like a slap, but I wasn't moved. How could I be? How could I forgive the man who had orchestrated my slow, systematic destruction? How could I ever trust him again? "Help me," I repeated, my voice icy. "You poisoned me, James. You tried to kill me. And you used Nina as your accomplice. All because you couldn't stand seeing me succeed." He flinched at my words, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing my pain. I was done with him. Done with his lies, his excuses, and his manipulation. Nina, still recovering on the bed, managed to lift her head slightly. Her face was pale, but her eyes were now sharp, filled with fear and regret. For the first time she looked small. She wasn't the confident woman who had once tried to intimidate me at every turn. Now, she was just a woman caught in the web of her own deceit. "You should have listened to me, James," Nina whispered, her voice weak but filled with venom. "You said it would be easy. Just a few sick days, and she'd be out of the way. But now, look where we are." "This wasn't supposed to happen," James muttered, his voice trembling. I didn't think it would go this far." Nina glared at him, her anger cutting through the fear. "Of course it did," she spat. "Because you're weak, James. You were always too afraid to do things on your own. You had to rely on me, and now look where we are. You messed everything up." The tension in the room was thick, the silence that followed almost suffocating. I watched them, the two people I had trusted the most in my life, unraveling before me. The husband who promised to protect me, the sister-in-law who pretended to be my friend. They had plotted against me, schemed to destroy everything I had worked for. And for what? Because of jealousy? Because they thought they could take my place? The thought made my stomach churn, but I refused to let it show. I had spent too long being a victim, too long giving them the benefit of the doubt. Now it was time to take control, to make sure they couldn't hurt me anymore. "I've had enough of this," I said, my voice steady despite the anger and betrayal coursing through my veins. "You both thought you could take me down, but you were wrong. I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you." The paramedics returned just as the tension reached its breaking point. They moved quickly, taking Nina's vitals and preparing her for transport. James stood aside, his face pale, his hands trembling. He wasn't saying anything anymore. The weight of his actions was settling in, and he realized just how badly he had screwed up. "I'll ride with her to the hospital," I told the paramedics, my voice firm. "I need to make sure she gets the proper treatment." I glanced at James one last time, and for the first time, I saw him for what he truly was. A coward. A man who had let his greed blind him to the woman he had married, the woman who had trusted him. As they wheeled Nina out, I followed behind, keeping my head high. I wasn't going to let them win. Not like this. Not after everything I had been through. I had the proof, and I was going to make sure they paid for what they did. The hospital was a flurry of activity, as Nina was rushed into the emergency room. I sat in the waiting room, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. I knew I had done the right thing, but part of me was still shaken by the whole ordeal. I had spent months second-guessing myself, wondering if I was imagining things, if I was just paranoid. But now, with all the evidence in front of me, I knew the truth. And the truth was much worse than I could have ever imagined. I didn't have to wait long before Dr. Phillips appeared in the doorway. Her expression was serious, but there was a hint of relief in her eyes. "Mrs. Bennett," she said, "we've stabilized your sister-in-law, but we found something concerning in her blood work. The toxins we found are not something that should have been in her system. They're consistent with pharmaceutical-grade substances used in testing. We're looking at deliberate contamination." I nodded, my stomach turning at the thought. "I knew it," I whispered. Dr. Phillips gave me a sympathetic look before continuing. "I've already informed the police. They'll want to take a statement from you, and we're running more tests to determine exactly what substances were used." "Thank you, Doctor," I said, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. "I just want to make sure Nina gets the treatment she needs." Dr. Phillips nodded and left, and I sat back in the waiting room, my mind racing. The police were coming, and soon James and Nina would have to answer for what they had done. I had the recordings, the text messages, everything. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. The sound of sirens outside grew louder, and soon Detective Mendoza entered the waiting room. She was tall, confident, and exuded an air of authority. She walked straight toward me, her eyes locking onto mine with a knowing look. "Mrs. Bennett," she said, "I understand you have some evidence regarding your sister-in-law's condition." I nodded, pulling out my phone and playing the recording of Nina's confession for her. Detective Mendoza listened intently, her expression changing as she absorbed the details. When the recording finished, she turned to me, her face hardening. "This is more serious than we thought," she said. "We'll need to get a warrant for both of their homes and offices, and we'll need to speak to the pharmaceutical company about how they obtained those substances." I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. The truth was coming out, and nothing was going to stop it now. "Thank you," I said softly. The detective gave me a small nod and left to speak with the officers. I stood up, my phone still in my hand. I had the evidence. I had everything I needed. Now, it was time to make sure James and Nina paid for what they had done. The days that followed were a blur of police investigations, interviews, and mounting evidence. Detective Mendoza and her team were thorough. They raided both James and Nina's homes, their offices, and even their personal effects. The substances used in the poisoning were traced back to a pharmaceutical company, one James had access to through a college friend working in their research department. Everything pointed to a meticulously planned conspiracy designed to take me down. But the most chilling part of it all? Nina's confession. Every word she had spoken in that hospital room had sealed their fate. She had planned this for months, keeping a detailed record of every poisoning attempt, including the doses, the reactions, and the desired outcome, to ruin my career and force me out of the business. And it wasn't just about sabotaging me. It was about eliminating me altogether. I spent the next few days coordinating with my lawyer, reviewing every document, every piece of evidence, and preparing for what was sure to be a long and arduous trial. I had no illusions about how difficult it would be. James and Nina had powerful connections, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. But I was determined. I had come this far, and I wasn't going to let them walk free. Not after everything they had done. Not after all the pain, the humiliation, the nights spent in hospital beds, wondering if I would ever get answers. Now, I had them. Now, I had the truth. The trial was everything I had expected, and more. Every day, the courtroom filled with tension as the prosecution laid out their case against James and Nina. the evidence was overwhelming. The bottles of pharmaceuticals found in James's office, the text messages between him and Nina plotting my downfall, the recordings of Nina admitting their plan. It all painted a clear picture. They had tried to poison me, and they had done it with the intention of ruining my career and my life. But what struck me most was how James and Nina acted during the trial. James, who had once been so charming, so attentive, now sat slumped in his chair, his face pale and drawn. He couldn't even look at me. Nina, who had always been so confident and calculating, now looked small and fragile. Every day she seemed to shrink under the weight of the evidence. There was no denying it anymore. Their defense was weak, a series of excuses and lies designed to shift the blame. James claimed he had only been trying to help me, that he thought he was doing what was best for me, but his words rang hollow. The jury could see through him. The evidence was clear. The prosecution called expert witnesses who testified about the toxins found in Nina's system, how they had been used deliberately to cause harm, how they had been escalated over time. It was chilling to think about how far they had gone, how they had plotted to make me sick enough to miss important meetings, to sabotage my reputation, to make me weak enough to be pushed out of the business. But they had underestimated me. They had underestimated my strength. The verdict came a week later. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. I sat at the front, my hands folded in my lap, trying to maintain my composure. I had spent months preparing for this moment, and now it was finally here. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. He cleared his throat, his voice grave as he read the charges against James and Nina: attempted murder, conspiracy, poisoning. The charges were serious, and the evidence was irrefutable. The defendants, the judge said, his voice stern, are hereby found guilty on all counts. The premeditated nature of their actions, carried out over an extended period of time, demands the maximum sentence. I could hardly believe it. They had done it. They had been convicted. They were going to pay for what they had done to me, to my career, to my life. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. And finally, after everything they had put me through, I had won. As I walked away from the podium, the weight of the past years still hung heavily on me. The trial, the betrayal, the lies, it all felt like a distant memory now, but the scars would remain. I had won, yes, but I knew that victory came with a price. My trust in people had been shattered, and it would take time to rebuild the relationships I once held dear. But one thing was clear. I had found a strength I never knew I had. I had survived. It wasn't just about the business or the clients. It wasn't even about the betrayal anymore. It was about reclaiming my life, my identity, and my sense of self. I had spent so long second-guessing myself, wondering if I was imagining things, if I was just being paranoid. But now, with everything laid bare, I knew the truth, and the truth had set me free. But as I stood there, receiving congratulations from colleagues and clients, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of my story. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still lessons to be learned, relationships to be healed, and perhaps new betrayals to face. The world wasn't perfect, and not everyone was as they seemed. But I was ready for it. I had learned that sometimes the people closest to you could be the ones who hurt you the most, but that didn't mean you had to let them define you. As for James and Nina, their lives were forever changed. They had gone from being powerful figures in my life to criminals, convicted and sentenced for their actions. Their plans to destroy me had backfired spectacularly, and now they were paying the price for their greed and jealousy. But as I sat in the quiet of my office, staring at the glowing screen of my phone, I couldn't bring myself to feel any satisfaction. I didn't need their downfall to feel whole again. Their pain was a consequence of their own choices, not my victory. The real lesson here wasn't just about revenge or justice. It was about resilience, about the ability to keep moving forward, even when everything around you seems to be falling apart. And it was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand tall in the face of betrayal and say, "This is not the end of me." So, I'll leave you with this question. How far would you go to protect yourself when the people you trust most turn against you? What lengths would you go to reclaim what's rightfully yours? Let me know what you think. Share your thoughts and experiences. And remember, no matter how dark things may seem, the light is always just ahead, if you're willing to fight for it.